A child is strapped to a bed on a locked ward, and a doctor is about to inject a virus into their bloodstream. Not by accident, not in secret defiance of the rules. This was the rule. Somewhere in New York, behind a fence that parents were told existed to protect their children, over 700 kids were deliberately infected with hepatitis, and their families signed the papers themselves. They were told it was the only way in. The institution was full. The waiting list stretched for years. And then, quietly, an offer arrived. A special ward, cleaner, better staffed, faster admission, if only the parents would agree to something called a study. Nobody said the word infection. Nobody said experiment out loud. What they said was safer, healthier, forward-thinking. What they meant was something else entirely. For nearly 2 decades, this continued, funded, published, defended by respected men in white coats. The children could not consent. Many could not even speak. And the truth stayed buried in medical journals, written in clinical language, designed so no one outside the profession would ever understand what it actually described. Until one reporter, one hidden camera, and one unlocked door changed everything. What was really happening inside those walls? And how did an entire government sign off on it? The year is 1955. The place is Willowbrook, a sprawling state institution on Staten Island, built to house children with severe intellectual disabilities. It was designed for 3,000 residents. By the 1960s, it held over 6,000. Overcrowding wasn't a side effect. It was the engine that made everything else possible. Wards built for 40 held 80. Staff meant to supervise 12 watched 50. And into that chaos walked a research team with a proposal that sounded, on paper, almost merciful. Hepatitis was already spreading through Willowbrook naturally. The filthy, crowded conditions made it inevitable. So the researchers reasoned, if children are going to get infected anyway, why not control it? Choose the strain. Choose the dose. Choose the outcome you can study. Doctors called it the natural history of infectious hepatitis. Parents were handed a permission slip. Somewhere between the pages, they were led to believe their child would be safer inside the special unit than in the general wards. Some were true, but what they were not told was that the special unit was the source. Children as young as 3 were fed extracts made from the stool of already infected patients. Others received injections drawn straight from infected blood. This was not treatment. This was manufacture. And here is the detail that stops you cold. The very doctors who ran the program insisted the children would have caught hepatitis. Regardless, they weren't causing harm, they claimed. They were simply choosing when it happened. The paperwork looked routine, but underneath every signature was a family desperate enough to trade almost anything for a place inside those gates, and a system that knew it. Here is what the records actually show. Between 1955 and 1970, researchers, led by a respected virologist, ran a controlled hepatitis program on children who could not refuse, could not question, and in many cases, could not even understand what was happening to their own bodies. The stated goal was legitimate on its surface, understanding how hepatitis spread, testing early forms of what would one day become protective treatment. But legitimate science does not require deceiving the people whose children you are using. The so-called consent forms describe the study in vague, reassuring terms. Some parents later said they believed they were agreeing to a vitamin program. Others simply signed whatever was placed in front of them. Terrified refusal meant their child would be turned away entirely. This is not consent. This is coercion wearing a lab coat. The children infected were monitored, not necessarily treated. Blood was drawn repeatedly to chart the disease inside their small bodies. Some developed liver damage. Some suffered for months. The researchers recorded it all and published their findings in respected medical journals, where the work was treated as a scientific achievement. Here is the moment that redefines everything. The same institution that ran this program later admitted, internally, that new patient admissions were being deliberately delayed unless families agreed to the hepatitis ward. In other words, Desperation was not a side effect of the study. It was the recruitment strategy. For 15 years, this went almost entirely unquestioned by the outside world, hidden behind gates, behind jargon, behind the quiet assumption that institutions caring for the most vulnerable would never do something this calculated. Oversight boards approved the work year after year, trusting the credentials of the men who ran it more than the well-being of the children inside it. And so the ward kept operating, one signature, one desperate family, one silent child at a time. In 1972, a young reporter named Geraldo Rivera walked into Willowbrook with a hidden camera and no advance warning. What he found was not the hepatitis ward specifically. It was the entire institution, exposed in its rawest form. Overflowing wards. Children sitting in their own filth. Staff stretched impossibly thin, doing the best they could inside a system built to fail them. The broadcast aired that night, and America watched, horrified, as the polite language of research and care collapsed into images no one could unsee. Public outrage was immediate. Lawsuits followed. Within a few years, the hepatitis studies ended entirely, and Willowbrook itself began a slow, forced closure that wouldn't finish until 1987, more than 3 decades after the experiments began. But justice, if it came at all, came late and incomplete. No one involved in designing the hepatitis studies ever faced criminal charges. The lead researcher's career largely survived the scandal. Some of the children who endured the ward carried liver damage and the psychological weight of what happened for the rest of their lives. What Willowbrook did leave behind was something bigger than punishment, a reckoning. The public outcry helped drive new federal protections for people who cannot consent for themselves, rules requiring genuine, informed, pressure-free consent before any child, patient, or vulnerable person can be enrolled in medical research. Every ethics review board that exists today, quietly checking research proposals before they're approved, traces part of its authority back to a locked ward on Staten Island and the children who never got to say no. That is why this story still matters. Somewhere right now, a form is being signed by someone who trusts the person handing it to them, and Willowbrook forces us to ask how we'd know if that trust was being used against them. History rarely repeats through villains twirling mustaches in the dark. It repeats through ordinary people in white coats, official letterhead, and forms that sound reasonable enough to sign without reading twice. Willowbrook wasn't hidden in some forbidden basement. It operated in plain sight, protected by nothing more than the assumption that no one would question it. That is the real lesson buried in this story. Power doesn't need to hide when silence does the hiding for it. Every institution we trust, hospitals, schools, governments, earns that trust only for as long as it deserves it. And history shows us exactly what happens the moment it stops. The children of Willowbrook could not speak for themselves then, but their story still can, now, through every person willing to remember it instead of looking away. So we have to ask ourselves, what forms are we signing today without reading the fine print? What silence are we mistaking for safety? Tell us in the comments what part of this story disturbed you most, and if you believe these hidden histories deserve to be remembered, subscribe, because there are more forgotten truths still waiting to be exposed.